Hello, everyone. Thanks to Brendan for putting together this workshop. Delighted to be here. Today, we want to present some work in progress. My name is Aphra Kerr. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University in Ireland. And my co-author and presenter is here as well, Josh.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Josh Moody and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology, also at Maynooth University.
So we thought that we would just present a little bit of work that we've been working on together in Maynooth, and just in case you don't know where Ireland is, that's us there. It's a long way away from Queensland, and it is winter. We've had our first snow, so we thought we'd share that with you. But today, really, we want to present some work we've done with Game Workers Unite Ireland, and we want to reflect on it in terms of this workshop and game production studies. And I think looking back, because I can do it at this point, I've been around game production studies for a few years now, we can identify a series of waves of research in game production studies. And to me, it does appear that we're perhaps on the cusp of entering a new one. And maybe some different questions need to be asked, some different research methods might need to be used. And I think that we can think about what we're doing as game production researchers, not just in terms of researching about game making or the games industry, but actually thinking about our role as researchers in terms of giving voice and also exploring how others are taking up positions of voice. And here we're inspired by some of the work by Nick Coldry and others on the sociologies of voice, public sociology by Burraway in 2004, and others who have worked in informal education and in the sociology of knowledge. So I think when we think about games production research, there really was a period from 2000 on where people from different disciplines were coming together and starting to try to figure out what types of companies were making games, doing ethnographies in games, interviews with game makers, trying to figure out what really this thing games industry or games production was. And this, I think, we can think about in terms of a first wave of game production studies. I think that we have just perhaps then, just like most of the industry really since 2012, been looking at fundamental shifts, a shift to indies, a shift to independent game makers, a shift in the literature to thinking about what exactly is an independent game maker, but also thinking about these other less visible roles, support roles like Ergen's work on game testers and other work on community managers. Really, and this in terms of research has been a little challenging because it was often trying to identify game makers who didn't have a place of work. So who are working from home, who are working together in informal networks, who are in parts of incubators. And so here a lot of our research challenge was about finding the game makers, right? Rather than going to places of work. And so we've seen over these first two phases some really important work and conceptualization, thinking about hope labor, about people who are trying to get into the games industry and the creative and media industries more generally, making creative work, sharing it online in the hope of gaining access to game making, the game industry, and a solid platform for, I suppose, making a career and earning a living. Perhaps we have also seen how passion has been mobilized both by game makers and by the industry itself in terms of hailing future game makers and game workers, and having this sort of discourse between formal organizations and students and would-be game makers. But perhaps at this point, while this is really important, we may need to look at going beyond this. And so this is where in our presentation and in our work that we're doing at the moment, we're trying to consider what might be going on and how we might want to respond to it as games researchers. Perhaps there is a third wave. And when we're starting to see new forms of organization and coming together of our indie game makers and our support and invisible game workers, We're starting to see in these articles that Paolo and Jamie are writing about the UK, unionisation in the UK. We're starting to see happen a little bit later, but actually quite tied into the UK discourse, the Game Workers Unite in Ireland over the last year, and we're seeing it in other countries as well. And that perhaps we can think about this or conceptualize this work and these trends as an attempt by game workers and game makers to find voice, right? This is actually about workers coming together to find their voice. And perhaps for games researchers, this should be about researching with game workers rather than researching about game making and about games production. Now, in the last year in Ireland, Game Workers Unite was launched. You can see here on the left part of this screen as we present the images of the cake, the launch cake, and Ellen Cunningham, who is the visible face of Game Workers Unite in Ireland, quite excited to present this in Ireland. And they're affiliated in the local context with the Financial Services Union, which I think is quite an interesting association in and of itself that perhaps we can think about as well. But here we're seeing game workers coming together and trying to learn about organisation from a traditional union, which actually was established about 100 years ago in the Irish context. We have here, as Jamie and Paolo have pointed out, we have the lead person in Ireland, Ellen, who is hyper visible in the local context. And I think that's a really useful way of pointing to the ways and the vulnerabilities, I suppose, of the people who are to the fore in the local unions. But perhaps we can even go beyond this to think about what's happening here in terms of voice, in terms of the practice of building and coming together to find voice in structures and in a period, a historical period, very much aligned with neoliberalism in the local context in Ireland, where both in economics and in politics, it's about individualizing people and where voice is often denied to many people. And whether this is through work contracts or however it is, I think it is important and that it was a useful contribution to the literature by Nick Coldry and others to start to think about voice as a value, as practice, and as process. So really what we want to contribute here is to think about what's going on with these union movements in terms of finding voice and in terms of what we as researchers can do to support this finding of voice and to reflect on our own practices as educators and as researchers. So this report literally just came out a couple of weeks ago. We wrote up the report for the local Unite Union. It's a survey of local game workers and work conditions in Ireland. But importantly, it is the respondents are people who self-identified as game workers. So we're not saying or trying to find the game workers. We're not going out to places of work. These are people who are actually coming to the fore to say they are game workers. And in this sample, we have 223 respondents. And I'm going to hand over to Josh now, who'll take us through just a couple of the findings.
Thanks very much, Aphra. Yeah, so as Aphra just mentioned, what was particularly interesting about this project was the fact that the Game Workers Unite membership actually approached us after the design and implementation of the survey, and they were really looking to collaborate with us. First of all, I suppose, to analyse the findings of the survey, but also to sort of identify the significance of those findings within the wider context of the games industry, and to provide some advice and maybe some recommendations about how to proceed from there. So they were quite interested in some really practical questions. So who was working in the games industry, where were they working, and what roles were they working in? And they were quite interested in what the different pay grades were and how that compared then to the costs of living. So the overall emphasis and the overall findings emerging from the survey really emphasised, I suppose, the material implications of the working conditions for standards of living. So how that emerged through issues of low pay, informal expectations and demands that often resulted in working overtime, which was also unpaid, a general lack of benefits, combined then with a lot of employment insecurity, job insecurity through impermanent contracts, layoffs, etc. And then also what was quite interesting were the services, and I suppose what the membership were actually looking for out of this process of unionisation. So they were looking for three main things, and they were community, advice and services, and this is what they wanted out of the process. So as Aphra mentioned, there was 223 respondents in the survey, and these how this broke down. So it was heavily male dominant response. So this is quite typical across the industry. So 72% of respondents were male. The majority of respondents were younger, so 57% between 18 and 30 years of age. And there was a nice balance between different types of companies, between Indigenous firms, multinationals, and Indigenous firms that were also bought over by multinationals. So what was particularly interesting about this survey was the balance between core development roles in programming, art design, and support services. So the game sector in Ireland is typically predominantly support services, localization, and QA. So it was interesting that of the balance in this survey, and it was quite good for the findings. So roles in the games industry based on these findings were quite heavily gendered. So you can see here that the vast majority of those working in programming, art and design roles, and in particular management and production, were male, and most females were in localization and QA roles. So this then had serious implications for standards of pay and how that then shaped up to the costs of living, in particular in Dublin City. And you can see here in the top left, the vast majority of respondents are paid on the lower end of the pay scale. So this is a gross monthly income. And when you put that in contrast with the percentage of monthly income spent on housing at the bottom here, you can see that the vast majority of respondents spend above 30% of their gross monthly income on housing each month. So once we move in and start looking at, I suppose, how this is disproportionate based on gender, you can start to see the huge gender inequalities in the industry here, with the vast majority of those identifying as female earning below 2,000 per month. So 62% of male respondents were earning over 2,000 per month, compared to 72% of females who earned below 2,000 per month. So it was really quite a stark contrast there. Just to provide some context for how this, I suppose, spills over into the cost of living in Ireland at the minute. This is a recent survey of national rental prices. So you can see here national rental prices are at 1,400, just over 1,400 per month. But in particular, the average monthly rent in Dublin is over €2,000 per month, and of course many of the game production companies are heavily concentrated in Dublin. So there was also quite interesting differences based on pay, depending on the particular role that people were working in. So I suppose what stands out most here is the fact that programming and production are by far the highest paid roles, with the vast majority earning 3,000 or above. And then there's a huge contrast there with quality assurance roles and localization. So support services on the complete opposite end of that. So there is quite a polarized pay structure. So when respondents were talking about much of the I suppose the informality and the demands around working time, a lot of it sort of came from these sort of informal expectations that their employers had. So people were expected to take on, I suppose, to be available outside of working hours, but they were also expected to take on additional duties and additional responsibilities. And this all had implications because it was all unpaid work, essentially. And then I suppose one of the more headline figures was I suppose the prevalence of crunch time as well. So what was particularly notable in relation to employment benefits was, I suppose, the lack of employment benefits and I suppose the prevalence of employment insecurity. So the vast majority of workers did not have secure employment contracts. Very few had pensions, maternity, paternity leave, or even sick pay as well. So these also fed into, I suppose, those pre-existing sort of gender inequalities as well, because some of that disproportionately impact those with caring responsibilities. So the report sort of culminated in 5 key recommendations, and they were, I suppose, first of all, to foster dialogue across the game sector workforce, to build collective representation and voice, to combat that individualized nature of the work. I suppose to combat the wider neoliberalization of work as well, which, as Aphra mentioned before, suppresses voice and worker power. And then next, to facilitate workers' assemblies to I suppose, establish priorities, but also tactics for how to address these work and employment issues in the sector. And then one particularly important one for the respondents was, I suppose, first of all, to grow the membership of Game Workers Unite Ireland, but also to provide insights and services to that membership, I suppose, to begin that process of systematically mapping pay structures, different roles by gender and occupation, and how they differed by company as well. And then finally, to develop standards for employment practices in the sector, and that fed then into things like social partnership as well. So this was sort of like a virtuous cycle, and they all fed in and build upon each other. So the report seemed to have quite a good impact. It fed into I suppose, the unions, the union's charter, which you can see here at the top. So they've got a 6 or 5 point charter, which was based on the key findings of the report. And I'm going to move over to Aphra here now to finish up on the last slides.
Thanks very much, Josh. So I want to just kind of finish off by looking at some implications for games research, games production studies research. And I think some of the things that we have learned in this process are interesting to reflect back on. When we were first asked to look at their data, I was initially perhaps a little bit reticent because we hadn't designed the questions and we were handed over this data set. But at the same time now, I'm looking at this in a very different light, and I'm starting to think about this as a process of constructing knowledge and what it might mean for us, researching with rather than about game making, asking different questions, looking at the questions that game workers themselves want answered. And it's curious that, you know, we know that there are differences in pay, but really when we see the variety of roles broken down by pay, and then we start to look into the types of contracts, which often aren't talked about. And then the third thing that perhaps was not really was an interesting finding for us was that actually when asked about how levels of bullying and harassment, people were often unsure. They were not sure about what that actually meant. So it seems that there's actually still even more creation of knowledge, discussion to be had to kind of understand these intersecting inequalities, to really build voice and to find out what it is game makers want to say and where they want to say that and where they want that to be expressed. and that our role as researchers might be to work with them, to amplify their voice on certain issues, and to think about how we can use our positions, particularly those of us in tenured positions, to empower these workers and to build knowledge together. And this crucially takes us beyond critique and being critical researchers to really thinking about creating knowledge with these game makers. So I think we leave it there, and we'd like to just thank you for listening to our work. We look forward to discussing things on Discord and the other channels. Thank you.